Hello, everyone, and welcome to an exciting edition of the APF podcast series. Today, I have with me an amazing woman who I deeply, deeply admire, and it's a true honor to have a conversation with her. Our guest today is Her Excellency Bisi Adeleye-Fayemi. She's the founder of Above Whispers Media Foundation and also the co-founder of Africa Women's Development Fund. Your Excellency, you're welcome to the APF podcast.
Thank you very much, Mosun. It is really nice to be here.
Awesome. So you're an extremely accomplished woman with a track record spanning the social and public sectors. You are a feminist activist, policy advocate, social change, philanthropy practitioner, and a prolific writer. And you've written several books, and just to mention a few, and I believe the favorite for me, Where is Your Rapper? And we also have Speaking for Myself, Perspectives on Social, Political, and Feminist Activism in Africa. I also recently stumbled on this. You co-edited Voice, Power, and Soul with one of APF's friends, Jessica Horn. This is amazing. You are a woman of many parts and you wear many hats. How did this evolution of Erelu Bisi Fayemi happen?
Thank you very much, Mosun, for your kind introduction. I believe I found my path as I was growing up, surrounded by a lot of women in my life, older women in my family. My mother is the firstborn of her family, and she had quite a number of younger sisters, and at least 3 of them lived with us. And there were also a number of other women in the streets where I grew up in Lagos, in Fade, after my parents came back from England, who were like big sisters in the streets, in the neighborhood. And then I would observe over time the lives of these women and the injustices that they suffered. And every time I asked, why is this happening to this woman? I would be told, oh, that is what the life of a woman is like. Women do not have a choice. I did not agree with this value system. And so I believe as the years went by, I began to dedicate myself to ensuring that women of all ages have transformative choices. So I believe I'm motivated by the need to use whatever platform I have to push for change so that women and girls can have choices so they can control their lives and be productive citizens throughout their life cycle.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I actually really like the fact that you made reference to your childhood growing up, the fact that there were women around you that you saw. And, I'm sure they also have their own stories, their accomplishments, but you just were not comfortable with the status quo and you decided to make a difference. And in our introduction, we mentioned that you are the founder of Above Whispers and also a co-founder of AWDF, which is, I believe, one of the foremost philanthropic foundations that we have on the African continent. What inspired you to start your foundation and also be part of AWDF when it was being founded?
As I said earlier, my thinking around trying to create opportunities for women so that they can have genuine and transformative choices led me to what I believe are 2 key concepts for me: voice and space. I have always been keen on amplifying women's voices and creating spaces for them to do so. Before I co-founded the African Women's Development Fund in the year 2000, I was with another African women's organization based in the UK known as Akinamama Wa Africa, Akinamama for short. And what we used to say at Akinamama, as a group of African women living in the UK with various identities, as professionals, as students, as refugees, asylum seekers, as women of dual nationality, we used to talk about creating our own space and speaking for ourselves. And so that is what led me to do a lot of work with women in the UK, in Europe, and on the continent around leadership, which again is about voice and space. And that journey led me to the African Women's Development Fund, which I co-founded with Joanna Foster from Ghana, may her soul rest in peace, and Hilda Tadria from Uganda. We wanted space for feminist philanthropy to thrive on the continent. Because even though a lot of progressive funders were supporting the women's movement on the continent at the time, particularly in the run-up to the Beijing conference in 1995, we felt that we needed a pipeline of resources that would go to African feminist leaders in their for them to do things that were important to them in their own communities, as opposed to what it is donors felt was important for them. And so over the past 24 years at the African Women's Development Fund, we have supported the women's movement to address a whole range of issues such as economic rights and justice, leadership and governance, bodily integrity, and movement building. And that work, as you mentioned earlier, still continues, and I'm extremely proud of what we've accomplished. I left the African Women's Development Fund in the year 2010, when I stepped down from being the executive director. I'm still on the board of AWDF because I had to move to Nigeria in 2010 when my husband became the governor of Ekiti State in Nigeria. In 2016, I decided to start the Above Whispers Media Foundation, which is an online mentoring, information, and enterprise support platform for women, because I wanted to encourage a broad range of women, particularly older women, to use social media more productively. So I continue to enjoy the work I do with AWDF as a co-founder and board member, and the work that I do with the Above Whispers Media Foundation, particularly the Rapper Network, which enables me work with a broad range of young women across the country and some of them beyond.
Thank you so much, Erelu, for being a trailblazer in this space. I know that it's hard to tell the story of philanthropy in Africa, and especially women who led the charge in this space without your name coming up. And I know that something that is particularly dear to you is the issue of gender-based violence. And it has multiple and multi-layered implications for women, not only physically, it does emotionally, mentally, socially, and even economically. I would like to hear your thoughts on how gender-based violence is limiting women, especially when we talk about the progress of the continent and the role that women can play, the potential women have. You know, this is one of the things that is holding women back. Can you share a bit more about that and what steps we can take towards achieving gender justice?
Thank you, Mosun. It is important to take all forms of sexual and gender-based violence seriously. 1 out of every 4 women around the world has experienced one form of violence or the other, be it emotional, physical, sexual, or economic. These various forms of violence, in whatever way women experience them, renders women voiceless and without agency. It destroys lives and prevents women from achieving their full potential. This has serious implications for our development as nations or as a continent. We have a culture of silence and impunity that ensures that cycles of violence continue from generation to generation. We need to replace this culture with a culture of zero tolerance for all forms of sexual and gender-based violence. A woman who has been raised in a household where her father has consistently battered her mother, and her mother continues to live in that environment without a voice and without agency of her own, or without choices to be able to make better decisions for herself, that young girl grows into a young woman who might find it acceptable if she finds herself married to a man who is exactly like her father. And this will then continue from one generation to the next. So this culture of impunity needs to be replaced with a culture of zero tolerance for all forms of sexual and gender-based violence. You asked about what can be done to address this and also to achieve gender justice. There are a number of things that we can do that have proven to be effective, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I'll just mention a number of them. First of all, we need to continue to advocate for legal and policy framework. And where we do have legal and policy frameworks, we need to ensure that these frameworks are implemented. In Nigeria, for example, we have the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act, which was passed in the year 2015. And this law is supposed to protect all persons in the country of both genders from all forms of sexual and gender-based violence. But it's one thing for us to have laws in place. It's another to ensure that they're implemented in a way that means for it to mean something in the lives of ordinary people, especially women in their communities. And so in addition to these legal and policy frameworks, we need to ensure that we look at how we address the empowerment of women in holistic terms, because sexual and gender-based violence doesn't happen in a vacuum. Usually we are dealing with symptoms. We are dealing with symptoms of women's exclusion and marginalization. So if we want to make sure that we do something that will yield significant results and that is sustainable, we need to address women's socioeconomic empowerment in holistic terms, which means looking at women's access to education, to training, capital, technology, enterprise development or entrepreneurship, access to networks, and all the tools that they need to make them self-sufficient. A woman who is self-sufficient is able to make better choices for herself and for her children. We also need to prioritize the education of girls, because girls who are empowered grow up into women who can control their lives. And then we need to consistently engage in awareness raising and education so that we can shift social norms. It is these social norms that bind women into notions that they can't be better than who they are, that they have to conform to certain cultures, traditions, and expectations that continue to render them less than and incapable of being the full productive citizens that they can be. So shifting social norms is extremely important, and we can do that through working with champions in communities, through working with role models, and through projects that communicate what we are trying to say to local communities in languages that they can understand, and also where we can to work with male champions and allies. It's also important to get more women into leadership and decision making. In Nigeria right now, we have abysmal numbers of women in leadership at the National Assembly. We have women who are capable of leadership in all sectors, in the public sector, in the private sector, in social sectors. But unfortunately, we still need to do better when it comes to the notions of women as leaders in their communities. And then we need to invest more in the use of media, digital technology, and popular culture, because these are strong tools in terms of shifting social norms. And they're also tools through which we can engage young people. And I'd also like to suggest that we continue to invest in women's movements and the strengthening of civil society. And this is something that the philanthropic community has been very good at. But we need to do more of this, because we keep seeing a lot of backlash on these issues as we make progress.
Thank you very much, Erelu. These are important points that you have made. I'm comforted, encouraged, excited that we're making progress in some way, but it's important for us to do more and do more faster. I think that's something that we need to take away as the philanthropic community. I'm going to move on to something you're great at, which is storytelling. Would like to hear a story from you, or for you to share an experience of something that just stuck with you or has stuck with you over the years about the impact of the work that you have done. I know you already started sharing some of the impact of the organizations you've been involved in, but is there something that has just stayed with you that is a great example of the impact that these initiatives have made in Africa?
Thank you, Mosun. I have had the privilege of occupying different spaces and platforms on my journey. And one of the experiences I had, and I'm going to share this deliberately because it's quite recent. And it's an example of how, as philanthropists, we can find allies in spaces that we hadn't thought about or that we usually don't pay attention to. In 2020, the world literally ground to a halt during the COVID-19 crisis. And for those of us working on women's rights issues, on gender issues, we acknowledge the fact that we were dealing with two pandemics at the same time. While we were dealing with COVID-19, we were also dealing with a sexual violence pandemic as well. Women and girls who had places to go to during the day, who could go to school, who could go to the workplace, were trapped in their homes or in their communities with abusers, with predators. And so we continue to see an increase in the number of women reporting violations in femicides. And it became so alarming that many of us in the women's movement felt that we needed to take action to ensure that this issue was addressed within the context of all the other issues that our governments and leaders were trying to tackle as fallouts from the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, my husband was the chairman of the Nigerian Governors Forum as the governor of Ekiti State. And so as the wife of the governor and as the wife of the chairman of the Nigerian Governors Forum, that made me the chair of the Nigerian Governors Wives Forum. And when we started seeing the increase in the levels of violence against women and girls around us, we decided to come together as state first ladies in Nigeria to put pressure on our husbands to do more. And so in June 2020, the Nigerian Governors Wives Forum formally approached the Nigerian Governors Forum and asked them to declare a state of emergency against sexual and gender-based violence in Nigeria. And when my husband asked me privately, so what would it mean if we declare this state of emergency? I told him, I said, it would mean that you as governors of state are going to be committing yourselves to ensuring that you do more around either ensuring we have laws in place or implementing laws where we have them, and then dedicating the relevant financial, human, material, and technical resources that we need to address sexual and gender-based violence. And so the Nigerian Governors Forum declared the state of emergency on the 10th of June, 2020. Now, at the time that they declared the state of emergency, only 13 states out of 36 states in Nigeria had domesticated the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act of 2015. By the end of 2023, 35 out of 36 states in Nigeria now have legislation to protect women and girls from sexual and gender-based violence. This is due to the hard work and collaborations with Nigerian state first ladies, women's rights organizations, and donor partners. And I'm really grateful to the Ford Foundation and MacArthur Foundation, who supported the Nigerian Governors Wives Forum with funding for us to be able to look at implementation strategies in some of our states and to set up additional sexual assault referral centers and shelters in different parts of the country. This is a partnership and collaboration I had never experienced before between government, civil society, and donor partners and the women's, and I'm really, really pleased and proud that I was a part of it. And I'd like to see more of this happen in the philanthropic community.
That is an incredible story, a story of partnership, of influence, of collaboration, and just knowing the power that you have. I love hearing stories like this. Thank you for sharing. And that would take me to a question that I would say is similar to, or well, it's a build on to what you just shared, because you talked about different actors, all those that were involved. And I know that this journey cannot be embarked on by one person, one individual, one group. It's not just women. You know, there are different actors that have to come together. Who are the most important players that we need at the table to reverse the trend of GBV in Africa, and how best can we engage them?
Musum, I think everyone is an important player. Everyone has a role to play. Everyone has a different role, but we all have a role to play. The governments and policymakers have a role to play with regards to ensuring that we have the relevant laws and policies and that they're implemented as meaningfully as possible. Law enforcement agencies and the judiciary are also important because they are the ones who we need to work with on access to justice for victims of sexual and gender-based violence. We also need to work with community stakeholders and gatekeepers such as traditional rulers and religious leaders. These are the partners who can help change negative social norms and work on issues such as harmful traditional practices, and those who can help us use religious text in more progressive ways so that we can prevent the oppression and exclusion of women and various forms of gender-based violence. We also need to engage academic institutions because we need more research and data relevant to the issues we are trying to address. Medical institutions are important. We need the media. We need community and labor associations, our market leaders, our artisans, and we need families as well, because we all come from families and we all have families. And it is in families that socialization happens. And these are spaces where we need to have changes and conversations around gender stereotypes and expectations. Are we raising our sons to be leaders and take control over the spaces they're going to occupy in society, while at the same time we are raising our girls to be able to make the perfect rice and the perfect stew in the kitchen? We also need to continue to invest in women's rights groups because they are the ones who are usually at the front line providing services and serving as advocates. And we need to ensure that we have the kind of resources, a whole range of resources. I believe I mentioned them earlier, but I can't overemphasize this. And this is where, again, our governments and donor partners come in, because we are hindered by a lack of financial resources, by human resources. By that I mean we need mental health specialists, people who can provide a full range of interventions, including psychosocial support. We need medical specialists. We need gender specialists. We need social workers. And then, of course, technical support, forensic labs, material resources, sexual assault referral centers, shelters, a whole range of things which are usually in short supply in many of our communities. So everyone has a role to play in this. And I would like to believe that the sum total of this will help us ensure that we shift the paradigms in terms of how women and girls are perceived and treated, and make families and communities responsible for owning these issues. And so that we can stop making our families and safe spaces, which are supposed to be safe spaces, a breeding ground that enables abusers and predators. So I believe, Mosun, everyone has a role to play in ensuring that abuse and discrimination comes to an end.
You have done a great job of laying out everyone along the value chain that we need. And for me, the more important issue that you've touched on is the fact that we need to address the root causes so that we're not always treating symptoms. And this is what we talk about at APF. We really need to think about systems change when we're thinking about solving the problems that we have and that have plagued us for so many years. Now, you speak so well, Erelu, and you share the impact of the work that you have been doing. And I know that you've done great work, but I know it's not a walk in the park. You must have encountered challenges along the way. Would like you to share how you have addressed or surmounted some of the obstacles you have faced in this work.
Yes, Mosun. Well, as you've mentioned, we find ourselves so caught up in trying to deal with the fallout, trying to deal with the symptoms. We are left with very little energy and resources to address root causes and underlying factors. Or even when we know what they are, other people who are supposed to be responsible for helping us or working with us to address these issues do not want to let go of their power and their privilege and their control. So some of the challenges I've seen are these patriarchal norms and values that continue to make the lives of women and girls difficult in our communities. the manipulation of religion, the expectation of women's poverty, of ignorance, the rising cases of exploitation of young girls. All these underlying factors make it difficult for us to sustain our gains. And of course, there is the issue of access to justice, because if victims of sexual and gender-based violence do not have access to justice, they will never become survivors. Those of us in the women's rights community, feminist activists, we prefer to refer to those who have gone through sexual and gender-based violence as survivors. But the truth is, you cannot be a survivor if you don't have access to justice, if you don't have access to a full range of interventions that can give you the power and the control that you need again over your life. And so we need to try and address this issue of access to justice and the role that those responsible can play, law enforcement agencies, our governments, community leaders, and so on. Those are some of the challenges that I've seen. And sometimes it is those who are supposed to make lives better for survivors who are the ones compromising the chances that they have of getting justice. So all these examples that we continue to see in our communities of victims being scared away because some powerful people have intervened or they've come to pay off the families and so on. And this leads me to another challenge, which is around culture of silence and impunity. If victims don't get justice, they will never become survivors. And then the perpetrators are emboldened to continue to carry out their acts because they believe that nothing will happen. And many predators actually tell their victims that I will do this to you and nothing will happen. And sadly, in many instances, nothing does happen. Another challenge I've seen is inadequate or non-existent institutions. I've talked about the need for us to have sexual assault referral centers, for us to have shelters, for us to have resources to be able to support survivors. If we can't make these resources available, victims will not come forward in order for them to start their journey towards being survivors. And then a major challenge is the fact that we have many fragile communities with political instability, with conflict, with the ravages of COVID. This has serious consequences for women and girls. And so whilst these challenges are not unique to us in Nigeria, on the African continent, we need to invest in responding to these challenges and have them taken more seriously, because without appropriate interventions, we will continue to see cases of impunity, and we'll continue to address this issue for the next 20 years or so.
Thank you very much, Erelu, for sharing those barriers, but not only telling us what the issues are, but what we can do to move forward. And that takes me to our last question as we round up. You alluded to the fact that philanthropy or philanthropists are doing some work in this space earlier in your contribution. What more can African philanthropists and foundations do as we work towards this goal of reducing, eliminating gender-based violence and achieving gender justice in our society?
Thank you, Mosun. I have a long list. I hope you are willing to hear it.
We can take them. We can take them.
Because as we've been having this conversation, a number of things have been coming to me about some of the interventions that I've seen over the years, many of which I've worked, but unfortunately, before they can come to full impact or fruition, they have to stop for one reason or the other, and then we start over again. I think my first point would be, we need more resources for gender justice. Mustn't think about it. In the year 2025, which is next year, that will be 30 years after the Beijing conference. 30 years after governments of the world promised the women of the world that their lives will be better, that there will be opportunities for the next generation. I was a young woman at Beijing. I was a part of all those conversations, pre-Beijing, at Beijing, post-Beijing. And I've seen many victories along the way, but I'm saddened with the many setbacks that we've had, because we seem to be taking 5 steps forward and 10 back. And speaking to and about philanthropists, I think we need to look at what kinds of resources we have available for gender justice. Second, I would like to see more funding available for policy advocacy and implementation of laws. Not many funders are willing or able to provide support for policy advocacy, but if we don't have strong legal and policy frameworks, it will be difficult for us to sustain the work that we are trying to do or the gains that we are making. Then we also need more in terms of provision of treatment, care, and support for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. Remember what I was saying earlier about the path from being a victim to a survivor. Some of the work that was funded by the Ford Foundation, for example, and MacArthur Foundation that we did as Nigeria Governors Wise Forum, and to use Ekiti State as an example, because the resources that we received from the Ford Foundation in Ekiti State were also matched with support from the government. And so we were able to work on issues such as standard operating reporting procedures for sexual and gender-based violence, referral pathways, sexual assault referral centers, shelters, a gender-based violence fund for victims to be able to access so that they can rebuild their lives and become survivors. So we need more support in this area. We also need funders to continue to work on the issue of education and reorientation in local communities for them to be able to own the issue of gender inclusion and the mitigation of sexual and gender-based violence. It would be good to see more co-financing projects with governments, with philanthropic partners, so that we can strengthen systems in the public service. And examples of this, for example, are from some of the work that the World Bank has been doing around girl-child education in Nigeria. There's this project, Adolescent Girls in Learning and Empowerment, and that has been key in ensuring that we create an enabling environment to keep girls in school. And there's also the Nigeria for Women project that builds on the local agency that women have, and for them to be able to do economic empowerment programs that they can have control over. So it would be really nice to see more investment and support from philanthropic actors on these issues. Then we need more funding in the area of media and digital technology and popular culture, because these are spaces where you can find young people, and these are spaces where you can get messages across very easily. I would also like to advocate for funding for feminist and gender centers so that we can build the next generation of feminist thinkers, teachers, and activists. I have done a lot of work with gender centers around the country, and I'm quite worried about a number of anti-gender conversations that are beginning to happen in academic spaces. So I would like to see more support for progressive feminist thinking coming out of our gender centers. And this is work that we might not see the results of immediately, but are extremely important if you are thinking long-term around the issues we are trying to address. And a lot of funders are already converts as far as this next one is concerned, but we would like to see more philanthropic actors, particularly the big players, scale up support for women's rights organizations and make flexible multi-year support a norm and not just something that is done as a one-off. And then the last point I'd like to make with regards to this question is I'd like to see more support for regional peer learning and showcasing ideas that can be replicated. As a young feminist activist, I benefited a great deal from being able to move around the African continent and learn from my sisters in other countries in Africa around what they do to make movement building more impactful, what they do around political participation, what they do around ensuring that women's rights issues are addressed in national constitutions, what they are doing around providing tools around sexual and gender-based violence. So I learned a lot from going to work with sisters in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Uganda, so many countries across the continent, and countries where we had quite a number of grantees from the African Women's Development Fund. But a lot of young women do not have those opportunities these days, and not being able to engage in Pan-African thinking and learning is holding us back. So I think that this is something that we can look at to make our work more impactful and sustainable.
Thank you so much for sharing these action points. You've certainly thrown out a challenge to the African philanthropy community, and we look forward to working closely with you and the rest of our network to achieve gender justice in Africa. It has been wonderful having you on this podcast.
Thank you so much, Mosun. Thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed talking to you.